I think we have a huge expectation, immense expectation to pharma and biotech, and we have the pleasure, I don't know if it's a pleasure in this time to discuss such topics, to have as host and guest for the welcome, Christian Ehler, member of the European Parliament, member of the ITRE Committee, Vice Chair of STOA. Welcome today, and thank you very much that you take time in this crisis for us. We have very interesting guests, speakers, interventions. Alexander Natz, Secretary General of OICOP, a pharmaceutical confederation with SMEs. I think this is the core topic today. Then Mr. Bernhard Grimm, Director Healthcare Biotech, Europa Bio, and Monica Derequois, Director General of GERB. And we discuss now how we can help, how we can support SMEs, and what it needs that we have fast results, fast solutions, and perhaps also after the COVID-19 crisis, a better environment for SMEs to fight such pandemics. And now I give the floor to Christian Ehler for the welcome and opening. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Henrik, you have to unmute.
Yes, there he is. Should work now.
No, the result,
Now.
So wonderful, good morning. The most asked question in webinars in Europe these days is, can you hear me? Can you see me? Good morning to everyone. Thank you for having me. Just to give a short introduction to that in my occupation as the rapporteur for Horizon Europe, the next research program of the European Union. I think we have two challenges in these days. The one is, as you rightly said, the big expectation towards, let's say the pharmaceutical sector, and what Europe had been actually doing and to what extent that fits to the national strategies. I think that's a big challenge. I think Europe had been performing quite well in terms of the Commission. I mean, we reshuffled the budget practically within a week. We reshuffled €500 million and funneled it into the pharmaceutical sector, ranging from vaccination to the testing tools to financial instruments, which describes a little bit also in general terms the challenges in these days when in the very beginning the Commission and the EIB was able to deliver almost €80 million as a loan in 3 days to a German, more or less SME, but a pharmaceutical a biotech company. But it shows the full range of problems at the same time. It's still financing. We still have not really a very smart VC capital market in Europe compared to US or other parts in the world where you have special interest funds. We are living with a relatively dumb VC capital scene, if I may say that openly, after the enthusiasm of the early 2000s when I was running a biotech company in Europe, where there was plenty of money on the market. Yes, there is still capital available. The VC capital scene is vivid in Europe, but still we are lacking something like special interest funds, so more dedicated risk capital money for biotechnology companies. We still haven't developed biotechnology companies to a sector. They're somehow stuck in between VC capital, the VC capital market, and the big pharmaceutical companies. Most of them are bought then after the financially heavily intensive pharmaceutical trial phase by big pharmaceutical companies. So it's not the full flourish of a market. We didn't create the European champions compared to other parts of the world. There are reasons for that. There are super successful companies, but it's not the, let's say, the super success stories. And then the second challenge in more general terms, I mean, although we are very much focused on Corona and we are a little bit in the danger that, yes, now there's money for the health sector, now there's money for research all of a sudden. Looking a little bit ahead to the research funding in Europe, we are underfunded. I mean, in practical terms, we didn't reach the 3% of GDP spent for R&D, and more specifically in the sectors related to biotechnology, we are still underfunded in terms of the VC capital sector compared to other parts of the world. We still, and that is also a lesson from the recent crisis, we still don't have a coordinated functional system of clinical trials. I mean, not functional in the sense that we don't have clinical trials, but we still have different national regimes for clinical trials. It's difficult to streamline. It's still very expensive to compare to other parts of the world. It's not the most attractive place to do pharmaceutical trials in Europe. And still we have that kind of valley of death related to that. Pharmaceutical trials are extremely risky, extremely expensive in Europe, and that's the big hurdle for a lot of companies which are fairly successful, but then all of a sudden need a lot of time, but also a lot of money to invest in the pharmaceutical trials. So overall, I think the crisis puts the focus a little bit more on the pharmaceutical sector, on the success stories also of biotech companies, the big expectations related to that. But I think still we are lacking over the last 10, 15 years. We are still facing the same problem. We need more of a common market. We more of a streamlined pharmaceutical or clinical trial scene in Europe. And still, I think we lack a dedicated understanding from the financial markets on the specific and individual needs of biotech companies. It's still relatively dump VC capital money, and we still don't have a scene like in the US of, let's say, special interest funds, which are much smarter in terms of selecting, but also in terms of the understanding of the specific needs of biotechnology companies. So overall, it's a little bit of a mixed picture. Now you're in the spotlight, so to say. But on the other hand, looking a little bit ahead, I think we are still underfunded in terms of the public research money, and we still don't have a structured financial market and not very specifically dedicated to the needs of pharmaceutical companies and specifically SME-driven companies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ehler, for this analyzing. I think if I hear you, we have structural problems and we need reforms. How fast we will change this environment? What we can expect? Do you think we learn fast lessons out of this, that we are underfunded, that we need other structures in the internal market?
I mean, what you can see that depends a little bit on the perspective, whether the glass is half empty or half full. We saw that an EIB can react much more in a much more dedicated and quicker way when we are in a crisis. I mean, I wouldn't say that the 3 days we needed to finance COVAX in Germany is the blueprint of financing biotech companies, but it shows that it could go much quicker. It shows that if we are tackling big challenges like that, we need big money. And I mean, if you look a little bit more in the nitty-gritties of what we are doing, we still have a problem with the clinical trial phase. I mean, there is such as a common access to the market by the EMEA and then the national ones. But if you look closer, I mean, one of the biggest topics between research ministers had been the harmonization of clinical trials to find a vaccine, but also, or to get a vaccine to the market, but also on the testing side. So I think structurally you saw that if we are under pressure, we can react quicker, we should react quicker, and we should try to learn the lessons and establish that in perspective in times where we are not in a crisis and everyone has the big bazooka in terms of money and the willingness to change something political. So if we are managing to take that in the next year and in the next programs, in more coordination on the health sector between the member states, then we are able to use that positively and not just being flexible in a time of constraint.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ehler. And we're coming now to the first intervention, Mr. Alexander Natz, Secretary General of OICOP. I think you will give us a very interesting perspective because you are representing SMEs, and what is now the situation? Can you give us a glimpse what's happening now, and what is your ideas, what should be done now? Please, the floor is yours, Mr. Alexander Natz.
Okay, Mr. Natz, can you hear us?
Hello?
Yes, we're here. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I would like to first of all thank you for inviting me, and I would like to pick up on some issues which have been mentioned by Mr. Ehler. Of course, finding a treatment or vaccine for, or better to say, against COVID-19, it starts with research funding, and we appreciate very much the Commission initiative together with the European Parliament to direct funds from the EU research program towards fight against the virus. There are these days important opportunities in that respect. The general picture, however, is indeed less promising when it comes to Europe. Indeed, many of our members are not only located in Europe, but they stem from sites in Cambridge in the US, in Boston, and there is a very different perspective when it comes to financing treatments and vaccines. So the pharmaceutical industry is, to a certain extent, especially for the smaller companies, many of those companies stem from the US because the funding environment is much more positive there still than in Europe. However, I would hope that with the crisis, this might change a little bit in Europe. But it's not only politics which need to come in here. It's also investors and funding opportunities. I'm not an expert in that respect, so I would leave it there. But just to emphasize that that we're partly making progress. I would also think that when it comes to finding a vaccine or a treatment, there will be funding available by whatever means of funding program or private investors. Yeah, I think that's a quite important picture here to start with. On clinical trials in the crisis, indeed, it is very important that we're continuing clinical trials. It is critical for R&D that we're making sure that these trials can continue in the crisis in order to have products in the market or to treat life-threatening diseases in other areas. We represent a lot of orphan medicine companies addressing rare diseases, and we haven't, and that's the good news. We haven't heard about too many companies which had to stop clinical trials. That's positive, but I must also say that there is support from the EMA these days. There is support from the European Commission. We have weekly calls with the Commission. We have weekly calls with EMA and the other colleagues from industry and from the wholesalers. Monica and Bernard are included in these discussions. It is a very it's very important to have those regular discussions with EMA and the Commission, and that's actually taking place. We do have, however, shortages in some products. There are these weekly reports to the Commission, and the Commission is trying to help on those issues when certain products are stuck in custody, cannot be imported into the Union, or in some countries there are export restrictions, such as India. I understand for some compounds where India is currently saying we're not exporting those goods because we need them for our own citizens. I think looking a little bit into the midterm future, I think it is I would guess it's almost decided in the Commission at least that they want to bring back production into Europe to avoid those type of situations in the future, not just in crisis situations, but also in general. We are very dependent on API production in India and China, and this will be one of the big themes the Commission will address in the pharmaceutical strategy, which is supposed to be released probably in the course of this year. You never know during the crisis, but I think one of the big topics for the future will be how can we bring back production into Europe. And we discussed it with our members, many mid-sized companies which are actually producing in Europe, and they told us it's not so easy. It can't be done from one day to the other, because actually we have very different production costs than India and China and other countries in the world, and also the increase of capacity for production cannot be done overnight, obviously, and I think that's very clear. I would like to touch on one other point here, and that's finding a cure, a treatment or a vaccine. And I think at the end of the day, it shows the importance of the pharmaceutical industry. Everybody actually is looking at when can we have a vaccine to go back to our normal life in a way. So the vaccine seems to be the key to me to go back to normal business, so to say, in brackets. That might take a while, as we can hear from the press, but I think it is very important that we have a clear understanding about what are the regulatory processes for those type of products, for the vaccine and for the treatment. The treatment is likewise very important, especially for those patients being in ICUs these days. Now, a normal marketing authorization process takes almost a year, or takes a year actually. So what are the vehicles the regulatory vehicles to get those products into the market rather sooner than later? We can't wait for a year to go back for a marketing authorization process. EMA has understood this. There is a process in place, they tell us, which can be done in a couple of months, 2 months. That's not a public statement, however, but this is what the estimation is. And also there are processes in place for compassionate use program at the national level, but that needs to be coordinated, because once we have something with a positive data readout in phase 3 clinical trials, we should have it available if the risk-benefit ratio is positive, and if the agencies can make a decision to say yes, we can give it to the patients on a broader scale because it has succeeded in clinical trials, then we need to be quick. I leave it there. I think those are some of the issues we're addressing these days. But let me finalize that we appreciate very much also the work of the European Parliament. There is a resolution out which on COVID-19, which addresses most of the relevant aspects from research funding to other elements, but also we appreciate the calls with the commissioners and the EMA. So it looks like the institutions are working these days. There is a good discussion ongoing to tackle the crisis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Natz, for this brief overview. Also that you tackled the cornerstones of the discussion, from the financial environment to the technical parts. Only one question: how is the data exchange on this level? If you have this idea that many companies are working on a vaccine and the solutions, is there a coordination, or is everybody fighting for themselves to be the fastest? How you can have...
Very good question. Very good question. Thanks for this. There is a launch of an EU COVID-19 data platform, because as we all know, research is very much about sharing data. And I think we have 2 companies, actually, at least 2 companies I'm aware of out of our 130 members, which are potentially having a treatment option available. I think most of the companies are willing to share, so we need to create those platforms. And the first start is a project which the Commission has started, the so-called EU COVID-19 data platform. Obviously, companies, and I think there is also a coalition of some bigger pharma companies, which I think is exactly moving in the right direction here. I think there are 15 companies exchanging data around COVID-19 research. I think probably the smaller companies might want to use more that like the government created data platforms. So I think this platform, which has been launched by the European Commission, is very much appreciated. But you're asking the right question. Very much is about sharing the data. We can't wait for everybody to make his own research, create his own research results. We need to share those results in order to avoid making the same mistake again, and also to have good discussions among researchers. So that's a very good question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Natz. And now we're coming to Bernhard Grimm, Director Healthcare Biotech, Europa Bio. I think I know I'm from Munich. We have a lot of startups also here in this field. What is your perspective now? What is your part in this solution, and what are you fighting at the moment? The floor is yours.
I hope you can hear me. I'm going to ask the same question as Mr. Ehler. Can you hear me well, and can you see me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for inviting me for this discussion. You know, at Europa Bio, we believe we represent the whole ecosystem when it comes to biotech. We have among our members, you know, a lot of national associations, obviously covering Europe, but also we have large, mid-size and small companies. And so what we are trying to do in our work at Europa Bio is really to defend the whole ecosystem and make sure that we have an ecosystem that is competitive. So maybe a few points, and I'm not going to repeat what Alexander said. I'm fully aligned with what he said, and I will not try to repeat some of the points he made. But, you know, we all believe that the biotech industry will contribute to the solution of this pandemic. And, you know, history has shown that in the past, you know, if we put all the minds together, we find solutions. You can go back, you know, to poliomyelitis, rabies, smallpox, flu, HIV, and even HCV recently. You know, all those viruses, these little bugs that have changed our life in the last months, have all been fought one way or another. So the question, you know, is not if we're going to find vaccines or treatments. The question is going to be when. And to answer that question, I think what we looked at Europa Bio is a little bit, you know, what is the ecosystem? And today, if you look at Europe, you have around something like 65 companies that are involved in either the vaccines or treatment options. Mainly, you know, 30 of them are in the vaccine area and 35 are in treatments. But what is extremely interesting to see is that if you look at this ecosystem, there are many SMEs in those. I think half of them are SMEs. And when you look at those SMEs, all of those, or a big chunk of them, are working, you know, with either academic centers or larger pharma companies. And this is very representative of the ecosystem in which we're working. You know, nobody can do it alone. You need to work together. And so this ecosystem obviously is extremely important. We have over 3,000, you know, small SMEs in the biotech arena, which are sometimes, you know, companies that are less than 10 employees. And this is one of the source of the innovation here in Europe. And we have other examples. If you take other fields, you know, of research and development, Alexander knows that very well. In cancer research or in rare diseases, today 70% of the solutions that come in treatment come from SMEs. So it's extremely important to have a thriving SME ecosystem in place that works very well with the other players. So what can we do when it comes to fighting COVID-19? I think, you know, I would look at maybe what we do in the urgency and in the short term. On that one, Alexander mentioned it just before. What is critical for the biotech companies is the continuity of the treatments and the continuity of clinical trials, because that's what patients deserve, whether they are COVID-19 patients by your way or not. I think most of the effort has been, and rightly so, you know, concentrated on what was happening in the ICUs lately. And on that note, as I know that we have many Germans on that call, you know, I'm Alsatian, I'm coming from the east part of France, and you know that COVID-19 has been extremely hitting that regions. And I wanted to take the opportunity to thank, you know, all our German colleagues on that. And I'm very grateful to see what has happened during the crisis where some patients have been flown to German hospitals. I think this is a typical good example of what Europe can do in those critical situations. I just wanted to mention it because I think it's important and it's close to my mind. What is important also at the moment is regulatory flexibility and clinical trials guidance. I think on that one, it has been mentioned before, the work we have been doing with the MEA has progressed very well. Obviously, not everything is perfect, but we have progressed extremely quickly and the dialogue has been extremely constructive, and that's certainly a lesson to learn from this COVID-19 situation. You know that at the start of the crisis, there were some export restrictions and other barriers, trading barriers that have been put in place. We have been advocating very strongly that those be removed, despite, you know, the urgency for some of the countries. I think that has happened. It's not always perfect, but it has progressed. India, China, US, you know, trading partners had to be engaged also to make sure that the fluidity of the clinical products and treatment would be guaranteed in the future. Again, there have been some hiccups, but it's good. I think the tariffs on medicines and medical and PPE, as it's called now, have been elevated, which is great. But one thing that is very important is that the EU member state guidance for importation of clinical products should require flexible documentation. And again, here in the rules, it has been mentioned by Mr. Elliott, it would be good sometimes that, you know, the rules are the same in all the member states. It would help for that. Another short-term concern we have, and we are starting to work on this in line with some venture capital firms, is that there is also a risk short-term for some of those biotech because of clinical trials that can be interrupted. It has not been too much the case, but if this period would be to last a bit longer, I think it would have detrimental effects. And obviously the biotech business model is stretched at the moment. So delaying, you know, trials or results of trial delays also, you know, access to finance. And that is a problem very quickly for some smaller companies that are burning cash at a rapid pace. And so we all welcome the work that has been done. I think we can really thank the Commission, the Parliament, and all the institutions like the European Investment Fund and the European Investment Bank for all the measures they have put in place. I will not go through the list, but you know that it's been extremely important. Just to mention, you know, the COSME program that now can mobilize around 8 billion for SME financing. There is also this Pan-European Guarantee Fund of 25 billion. The numbers are skyrocketing. I can mention also the SME strategy Escalar for new investment approaches that should be able to give easier access to venture capital up to 1.2 billion. All those measures, you know, are really welcome. There is the European Innovation Council Initiative Accelerator that also helps, you know, startup and SMEs. And I think it's also the opportunity to look at the concept of the European research area for a single market for research. All those initiatives are really great and we all welcome them. But again, to make those promises reality, we just need to make sure that there is clarity in the member states on the process for the calls, as well as the funding programs for research and innovation. And maybe the last point, because I think, you know, from all crises we need to learn. And at Europa Bio, we are looking at the long-term perspective of the European biotech ecosystem. A large majority of the treatment that come often from smaller biotech, and often they are from US origin today, if you look at those companies. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has tested the healthcare system for their readiness and their infrastructure. I think the solutions in the long run will come from smaller biotech that are the real innovation engine of the ecosystem. And for the long run, Europa Bio is advocating for a strong life science and biotechnology strategy to address the structural weaknesses of the European ecosystem. We believe that this ecosystem is at risk of being weakened at this time, that the future treatments are expected to come from smaller biotech, And we believe that the future industrial strategy should obviously prioritize life science and biotechnology, that is so that it's competitive and that we can avoid to happen what has happened to other industry. I'm mentioning sometimes the digital industry. And you know that we had the life science strategy in Europe in 2002. It was a nice document of intentions. If we look at 20 years later, I think we haven't made that much progress. And obviously in this life science strategy, there is a lot around SMEs and startups. We are advocating for expanding, speeding up and simplifying access to European and national funds instruments for SMEs. We are also, advocating for the implementation of the European Investment Bank recommendation to include a more unified and better capitalized public market for life science and R&D. We would like to see a one-stop shop for EU for small SMEs. We would like also to see if some specific supportive incentive could be created, like the EMA SME office, and a few other topics. But just to conclude, I think we need to create in this post-COVID-19 period a biotechnology ecosystem fit for the long run. And our next decision to invest in a strong life science and biotechnology strategy will be key to create the innovative engine Europe needs with a thriving SME sector. If I might to try this metaphor of the immune system in this COVID-19 situation that has been very stretched in the recent months, and particularly for elderly population, the stronger the ecosystem, the better we'll be prepared to master the upcoming health threats, because we know we're going to have other threats in this arena that the world will inevitably be confronted with. And this is the reason why Europa Bio is advocating for a strong life science and biotechnology strategy in Europe to support the goals of an ambitious industrial strategy for people and the planet. And I'm stopped here. But thank you again for the invitation.
Now I'm lost. Sorry, somebody told me out. I think it's very interesting because also the last part, to have this ecosystem also in the long term available. And I think we discussed it that also in Germany, that now a run of pharma and biotech companies will come from investors from outside, because this is, I think now for the next 5-20 years perhaps, a run, like you say, from the digital sector, and Europe can lose if we are only thinking, if you have not a complete strategy here. I think often we're starting with founding startups, and then we don't have a plan to bring them to the stocks. And we're founding superb startups, and then they're leaving Europe. Could that be really a danger? Have you already activities you find out that really investors coming or are interested to buy small SMEs now?
In those crisis situations, what happens is often the stronger can come and shop. That's the situation when crisis situation happen. If you look back at some of the crises, it has happened. The weaker links in the ecosystem are being poached in those situations. You know that the capital market in the US is 4 times the size of ours in Europe, at least. And what we know also is that China is moving very quickly. And you know that when China is implementing, they are implementing. And you've seen that they've tried to come also to look for that. So it's going to be a bit unfortunate, given the source of this pandemic, that would be favoring some other regions in the world. But this is the way it is. We say at least since I've joined Europa Bio, that we would like to see a little bit more unicorns in the biotech sector in Europe. And we know why that is not happening. Many have been bought before, and that is just because, most of the capital available is in other regions of the world. So we really need to address that. We know that there is a lot of innovation in Europe that is not grasped because there is not the capital market there. And some other investors that are more risk prone and have maybe more flexibility in terms of finance are coming and shopping where they can. And we have many examples of that. I don't need to give you too many examples, but I think, the COVID-19 situation should help us really to focus on that and really take it as an urgency to look at the strong ecosystem in general. And we know where the solutions are, we just need to implement them.
Thank you very much. I think this will be also a political discussion for the future or now already. And now we're coming to our last intervention, Monica Derecpoix, Director General of IR. Supply chains. I think this is your topic. I think we have also to bring this pharmacy and these products to the consumers. And I think what is your experience now? I think there was a lot of problems in Europe at the moment.
Yeah.
Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, indeed. So thank you very much, Horst and Henrik, for inviting me. And it gives me the occasion to shed some light on a sector which maybe has not this visibility as the pharmaceutical industry or the biotech companies have at the moment. It is about distribution. So the European Healthcare Distribution Association is the umbrella organization for full service healthcare distributors who all have full line wholesaling as the backbone, which means they carry on permanence all products in stock which are needed by pharmacies and other healthcare professionals who dispense medicines to the public. We cover about 750 different pharmaceutical wholesalers who serve 34 European countries, and the structure, yes, Henrik, we have some slides, but if you go to the next one, it better shows what I'm just talking about. Thank you. So the structure is varied of our members. It's a bit similar to what Bernard just described for Europa Bio. We have from large international companies who are quoted on the stock exchange to cooperatives, which are wholesalers owned by pharmacists, to private wholesalers. They are grouped in what we call Pharma Privat. Altogether, we employ about 140,000 people, and our members move 15 billion packs a year just of medicines, and then in addition, of course, to medical devices, food supplements, and everything you can buy in a pharmacy. There are upstream services and downstream services, upstream to the pharmaceutical industry, downstream to pharmacies and healthcare professionals. So yes, there is a well-established distribution infrastructure which was crucial to rely upon now during the crisis. And also, like, our members would also distribute this personal protection equipment, such as masks, gloves, which are very high in demand. If we move to the next slide, I would like to just explain you a little bit how we have coped with the crisis. So there was a surge in demand just before the confinement measures started, and shortly after. It was about 2 to 3 times to the usual level, and the distribution centers were really at the limit of their capacities. We had to make contingency plans for staff to continue operating, to be sure that if one team, somebody is sick, that there can be another team brought in who can cope, and the staff from bookkeeping, marketing, they were all used to help commissioning the orders. The first problem we encountered was that not in all countries full-line wholesalers were classified as critical infrastructure, which meant that we had problems to go, first of all in Italy, to go into the red quarantine zones. And it took a little while until all permissions were there, that the staff could access the distribution centers, and then of course that the drivers could enter the quarantine zones to cope with this surge in demand. The next point was then member states put export restrictions. Every country, when they were scared that there are not enough medicines and the shortages will increase, put for certain products, especially personal protection equipment at the beginning, export bans. what became very obvious is that there is a problem with the length of the global supply chain. So there are so many possibilities where products can be blocked within the length of this supply chain. And of course, the reliance on APIs coming from India and China, which was already mentioned by my colleagues. For India, there is still problems with the export bans. Also, the Commission has been very active, and the worst problems to our point of view have been already eased. Now we are facing the shortage on COVID-19 relating products, and especially the products used in intensive care units to put somebody on ventilation. However, the demand on other medicines now has come to a normal level. It came back, the surge has stopped, and for some product categories, we even see less demand than in the same period last year. If we move to the next slide, please. So we just have given a list of what was urgently needed by our sector. So the green lines, we had to ask that the transports can, for example, between Germany and Austria, where we go over Germany, because it's much faster. This had to be unblocked, but it was very, very quickly done by the German side. So thank you for that, to save time when you distribute from an Austrian region to the other Austrian region. And the green lines have helped a lot. Also in some countries, there is still room for improvement. The lift of export bans between member states, it's detrimental because no country has all the medicine it needs itself. So each and every, even the very large member states, depend on other countries, and the European solidarity idea came a bit later, and there is still room for improvement from some countries. The Commission has asked quickly the member states to lift what we call blanket export restrictions, and to look at those to what is really necessary and what is proportionate to the problem or to the shortage the patient face in their own country. And it had to be reminded that we have a single market, so if the export ban is not proportional to the problem, it is not legal. And then the other problem was that countries asked industry, but also healthcare distributors to keep national stockpiles, which then again prevent one country to the access to these medicines because they are stockpiled in another country. They're not necessarily the need was there. Yeah, the Indian export bans were a big problem. Now they have lifted them for 12 active pharmaceutical ingredients. One of the biggest problems was paracetamol, which was used in COVID-19 treatment, and where there was a shortage all over Europe of paracetamol products, which was not foreseeable because normally it is nothing innovative and something easily available as over-the-counter product. So that was not expected. And then the regulatory flexibility that was already mentioned also by my colleagues. For us, there is different, so this is good manufacturing practice. Our members are operating under good distribution practice. There is different regulatory flexibility needed, but we are also very grateful to EMA as well as to the European Commission that there is full willingness and understanding of giving us flexibility during the crisis. And it has been already, first aspects have already been taken up. Maybe Henrik, you could go to the next slide. And then we have been very relieved to see that the medical devices regulation has been pushed back by a year because it's impossible to now focus on the implementation of the medical devices regulation. Then we have to deal with the crisis. We also happy that wholesalers have and healthcare distributors have now been recognized as critical infrastructure in most of the countries. Maybe some, at the end, some further calls. So it is essential for us that the funding capacity is there. That is especially important for the SMEs, where we have many SMEs on national level. And just to give you an idea, currently healthcare distributors finance 12 billion euros on stock because we buy from the pharmaceutical industry until the medicines are paid by pharmacies is about 45 days. So there is a huge financing necessary. And if we are asked to increase stocks, then this becomes even more significant. And we also worried because we have our warehouse staff and our drivers didn't have access to personal protection equipment. Also, they had to enter the quarantine zones, and there is still now quite some confusion about, for example, face masks, where on one hand you have to have the face masks for the healthcare professionals, and on the other hand, the public is asked to wear a face mask, and then there is a surge in demand. There is also a lot of offers which are partially counterfeit, so it's very difficult to maneuver the way through. But in conclusion, I think our sector has shown its resilience and that it can deliver in a situation of crisis. We had to prioritize maybe the most urgent medicines, but if there was not a shortage, all patients got the medicines when they needed it. That was in a nutshell what I would like to convey to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you. This is important because the supply chains is this what we are. It's like the circulation of blood in the body. Without this, it will not work. But only perhaps a little bit difficult questions, but perhaps you can answer. Where we have more problems, with the global supply chains or with the European supply chains? That was more problematic.
It's a difficult question, but yes, I think the global supply chain is more problematic because it takes much longer. Some countries were then very, very fast to lift their export restrictions. Germany, for example, reacted then very quickly to lift the personal protection export restriction, whereas the global supply chain is much more difficult to fix, and then there is political interventions needed, like to lift the export ban from India, at least for some substances. That took really long, and if there is a problem globally, it's much more difficult to fix.
And then last little question from my side to you directly. While there also a global competition that some countries want to be first with some supplies and push the others away from the market, second?
Yes, indeed, especially for the personal protection equipment. So I mentioned already the masks, but it's also gloves, it's eye protection, face shields. The US was very pushing, and there were reports that even when a plane landed, there was bargaining on who gets the supplies. There were European initiatives to have a joint purchasing. I think this is a great initiative. Also, as it was not so well established, it takes a while until you get the offers in, and then until the goods are delivered, and then we have to spread them out to the countries who need it. So it takes a while. But I think Europeans are not used to these bargaining mechanisms which were applied during that crisis.
Thank you very much. And now we have the time for questions from the audience or from the speakers to the speakers. Perhaps if Mr. Ehler has also questions to the speakers, it is now possible. It is easy to, you can raise your digital hand or write in the chat if you have questions. I have only one until you have to think about your questions. If you have such, in the future, such strong support from the governments, from money, from institutional level, is there not a danger that a little bit also the competition is, the idea of competition of free market is going away, that this is becoming more and more controlled in the future by institutions? Perhaps Mr. Nutz, you have an answer, or Mr. Grimm?
Yeah, I'd be happy to kick off. I mean, I don't think this is an issue. To cut a long story short on this one, I think it won't be subsidies. It won't be state aid in the long run. I think what we're currently doing is looking into parts of the sector. We're not talking about large scale subsidies like we see it in the automotive sector, where that's a big issue for many companies. So I don't see it as a competition issue. It would be an issue if one member state would subsidize its pharma industry to a very large scale and others wouldn't do so. Then it would be a European state aid issue. So I don't necessarily see that. I think the research funding is very critical. So I'll leave it there. I have some comments maybe later on the joint procurement, which I see a little bit more critical. I think it should be restricted to certain situations. I don't think it's a magic solution to all our supply problems. But that's also not how I understand Monica. I think it should definitely be restricted. Maybe we can discuss that later. That was not your question.
Mr. Grimm, unmuted, please. As of now.
Yeah, I agree with Alexander. To me, this doesn't seem to be the highest risk. You know, nobody in our industry is asking to be subsidized. You know, we are used to taking risk, and we do not want to be subsidized in the long run. Now, what we see is more short-term issues, which is the access to the transitory measures that are put in place for finances, especially, you know, for the interpretation of undertaking in difficulties or the definition of linked enterprises when venture capital are over a certain threshold. We just need to make sure in the urgency that, you know, those companies have access to those financing tools, and that they are not excluded. You know, this is the urgency measure that is required. But we're not asking for long-term subsidies, not at all. Huh? The more independent the research can be done, the better off we're going to be. But here we are in an exceptional situation, so that's why we should really segregate the short-term urgency from the long-term perspective.
Thank you. We have also a question from Paul Rübig, our president of SME Connect.
Okay, Mr. Rübig, I will give you the floor. Where are you
Mr.
now?
Ehler.
I think Mr. Rübig left the chat, but he wrote the question also in the Q&A. So Mr. Rübig, former MP and president of SME Connect and honorary president of SME Europe, asked, Horizon EU, does it have a chance to 160 billion euros? Yes or no? And I think Mr. Ehler might be a good person.
I have also a question. Mr. Ehler, your floor is yours. Can you give us an answer?
It's complex. The problem right now is that we're running in a certain contradiction because the research program coming from an open sky research program more and more gets a political tool. People want that politically, but also the general public. But it has its consequences. So if you're honest, the Horizon Europe had been designed practically to address the CO2 reduction. It had been designed to boost the digitalization of Europe. But right now, more and more, we're reaching out for this program for the general European recovery, that at the same time, permanently, we will be confronted by the consequences of Corona. And so from my point of view, I mean, practically we are underfunded. And I'm not saying that because everyone is asking for more money. It's simply if you compare that to the other parts of the world, I mean, Japan, China, the United States, they're all spending more than 3% of their GDP for research and innovation, which is a shared burden by the industry, by the public sector. And what we see traditionally is that after a crisis like that, I mean, R&D spending in the industry goes down. Because they are in financial trouble, and what's usually happening, although we don't know, that's really not really helpful in that situation, but we see that even now statistically that in these days R&D spending in the industry goes down. So I think the lesson we learned from other crises in the past is that in this phase, I mean, we intensively have to invest into that, and the more we put burden on research program to, let's say, to deliver on general political issues, the more we have to invest. And my fear is a little bit that we are getting in a cannibalizing situation right now, because, I mean, we have the ambition on CO2 reduction. We have to invest into digital. We are going to face the consequences, the economic consequences of a crisis, and the only answer in Europe on that is innovation, because I mean this is a heavily burdened labor market that is a strictly regulated market. So our, let's say, our USP is innovation. And from that point of view, I think there's a growing understanding that on the European level, as it is on the national level, we have to invest more. But if I may add just, and for a moment in a unique situation, because usually politicians, you know, flying high over the horizon, I happen to be one of the founding members of one of the biggest biotechnology centers in Europe 20 years ago. I'd been the CEO, the founding CEO. And the interesting thing is that the general setting is pretty much the same, and the challenges. It's not the big money. It starts in the university that we don't have a very innovative kind of surrounding. I mean, we often have a very ex post kind of idea how success works, but practically you're a student or you're a professor. And there is not such as an innovation triangle in the universities. I mean, yes, we stipulate more entrepreneurship, that we had been doing that. It's a little bit more easier, but in practical terms, for example, it still lacks in the training of researchers a profound idea what is the regulatory and the scientific framework of funding a company. I mean, we're still running in clinical trials, or we're confronted with a situation that you start your testing of a certain substance not in a proper way ex post, because you would know that 4 years later, it's very important that you can describe the surface where you start your work, or the regulatory kind of documentation you don't have. Usually we are running still into the problem that after 2 years, we don't have a proper documentation from the very beginning about the regulatory, which fits to the regulatory needs. The regulatory needs are very complex still. And from my point of view, I think we're still lacking at the universities this kind of entrepreneurial, stipulating an entrepreneurial attitude. We're still lacking that there is much of advice about the complex regulatory framework you're facing perhaps 3 years later. And we still have a very dump VC capital scene, because after the enthusiasm of the 2000s, where we had a few biotechnology funds, but funded by banks, but then getting bankrupt because, I mean, the expertise simply hadn't been there. If you go to Boston, for example, I mean, the VC capital companies are sitting practically in the universities. You know, they're giving part of the academic training is that you get offered to study from the very beginning what are the conditionalities to get VC capital money. So let's say the innovation environment is much more dense in the universities. In Boston, you have them all together. They're sitting practically on a campus. And I think that's still missing. And that's something which is not about big money, but it is about the general attitude in that field to stipulate an entrepreneurial attitude, to help with the very complex European regulatory framework from the very beginning. And I think that is the lesson we have to learn, because I mean, in practical terms, I mean, all these fears having been invoked that the Chinese or the Americans are going to buy our unicorns, hard to tell. But it's interesting that it was so urgent that the EIB had to grant a loan within 3 days, about 80 million, to make sure that one of the, let's say, potential unicorns of vaccination research is not underfunded. So in a way that would never happen in Boston, you know, if you're smart, you stipulated from the very beginning, yes, to be a researcher, but to get all the skills you needed also to be an entrepreneur. And yes, there is, due to taxation laws and other issues, there is a VC capital scene which is much more intelligent about their investment. Usually a VC capital fund in Berlin or in France in these days is investing in a biotech company. And then from a risk portfolio perspective, they don't want to do a second one because they see that as a risk. They want to go to another angle of investment, because VC capital investment in these days is risk driven, it's portfolio driven, but it's not very dedicated. And I think we should stipulate that and have more dedicated instruments for the pharmaceutical, but specifically for the biotechnology company. Otherwise, I mean, most of the people are going to Boston in these days. Let's be realistic.
Thank you. Yeah, you want to respond? I have a feedback of my voice. No. Then I have to say, we're coming to the end. And I think this is a very important point, Mr. Ehler, you said in the end. I think we have this, like I say, in many fields, not only in this, in biotech and in pharma, this problematic. But I have to say, we have to change the spirit also in Europe. And it's starting at the universities. I have to say, when I was studying, I learned nothing about entrepreneurship. So this part is totally excluded from the universities. I have the impression, and I think we have to change this. I would say that every speaker has the moment wants to say one last comment, and then we're coming to the end, and perhaps a wish or an idea, last point you want to mention, and then this interesting debate is already to the end. Mr. Natz, you would like to start?
Yes, if I may, 2 wishes, but very short ones. I think anything which has been mentioned by Mr. Ehler is certainly very critical. I don't think we have made huge progress in funding SMEs over the last 10 years. We appreciate the work of the European Parliament. We appreciate the work of the Commission in Horizon Europe in that respect. So that's critical to be competitive with in European terms with US biotech companies, and that's a bit lacking these days. Second wish, more focus on the regulatory pathways and also the need to scale up production for treatment options for COVID-19 and even more so vaccination. So we need to have a stronger emphasis on what's the regulatory pathway for those products to have them available, not just a year after they have been concluded phase 3 clinical trials. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grimm.
Yes, so thank you again for inviting me. I will certainly finish on one Latin quote. You know that certainly very well. It says ad astra per aspera, which means through adversity to the stars. And I think we shouldn't spoil this crisis. Obviously, you know, there are urgency, everybody needs to take care of, and a lot has been done in the meantime. We need to make it happen for the companies that need financing quickly. But in the future, I think we shouldn't spoil this crisis and really reflect about a very strong life science and biotechnology strategy in Europe, because we know what the solutions are. And I agree with all the points that have been made by the speaker. We just need to make it happen, and we need to see what is the best way to do that and when is the right timing to do it properly. But with the industrial strategy coming, I think we have some opportunities to do that.
Thank you very much. And Monica, the floor is yours.
I just would like to add to that. I think it's important that we learn our lessons from this crisis, that we understand that how important is solidarity between the member states, and that it is essential that also the Commission has the competence we expect, because everybody was looking now, what is the Commission doing? But the Commission has very limited competencies, so we might reflect about that for the future, and perhaps we can be better prepared for the next crisis to come.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Eder, that you were the host of this event. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the speakers. I think this was not the last debate about this, and we will see what's really happening in the future. What is really the outcome of this? I hope we learned also something from the crisis. Like you say, Mr. Grimm, also something good can come out of a crisis. It's a chance. I hope we're using this chance. Have a nice day. Stay healthy. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.